I sort of backed into making art, I guess, is how I got involved in making art. I grew up in Manhattan. I grew up I'm part of this, I mean, I think of it as the Sputnik generation. You know, I was a firm believer that the Russians were out to get us with this tiny little ball that went around the Earth and beeped, you know. This little tinfoil ball that was beeping was really dangerous. So I was going to save us from the Sputnik menace. And so I went into engineering school, but there must have been something wrong with that connection because I kept failing calculus and getting A's in English, and although it took several years for it to dawn on me that maybe I was in the wrong field, and I still love, you know, science and technology, and that's basically where I get most of my inspiration from. I basically read about these sort of things, and these are the kinds of issues that I'm most interested in. I tend to not read art journals and know about what's going on much in the art world. So I flunked out of engineering school, and my father snuck me into Columbia, and that was, and a couple of years later it was 1968, and the school was shut down with this major strike, and there was this whole sense of radicalization, and I got to really think about everything differently. And then I went to Madison, Wisconsin, and Nixon bombed Cambodia, and I got to go out on strike and argue with my major advisors. By then I was interested in psychology. I was in grad school in psychology at that point, and I still use a lot of psychology in what I'm doing. So I was in Madison, Wisconsin, studying psychology, and and I had this sense, though, that in spite of all the other things, that I could kind of figure out who I was, and I could kind of actualize myself maybe better making art than I could, studying psychology. And I think that's how I got involved in art. Was this possibility for self-revelation. And basically, after we sort of had this agreement in Wisconsin that if I agreed to drop out, they would agree to give me a master's in psychology, and I wouldn't have to go through as much to defend my thesis as I would if I wanted to stick around and become a PhD. And they all hated me, so because I was trying to disrupt this function of the school. So. But I had good grades, so they couldn't just throw me out. So we had to have this agreement. So we reached this agreement, and I got my master's. And by then, I was more interested in the Grateful Dead and making art than I was in studying psychology academically anyway. So I was happy to leave. And this was '71. I moved into the Haight, and there were people hanging around, walking barefoot along the street, and there were like little startup businesses in between the boarded-up storefronts. And I was making art. But just sort of for myself. So I was making these kind of concrete sculptures, and I took a class out at City College, and I did go to the Art Institute and take a couple of classes, and that actually had a significant impact on me. What was going on down there really sort of transformed what was happening in my work. And right around that same time, I got the biggest transformation, though, was right around that same time I got to do 3 theater sets at the Magic Theater, and that just completely blew my work open. Just before that, I was starting to I was breaking my work apart because I didn't like the single point of view that most sculpture has. I was thinking, I would just actually cut things into pieces and sort of try to put them widely separated, the parts, and then pay more attention to how things were connected than what the things were themselves. So that was the beginning of this sort of opening up of the work, and then suddenly I realized, well, the set was kind of this sculpture that these actors were moving around in, and working with, and doing things to. And some of these plays I did actually had called for moving parts, things that would happen on moving mannequins that would raise their hands and turn their heads, and and so that just completely transformed my sense of what was possible. Probably, but I don't think it's more like what we want to do. The 2 arms that make the waves happen actually go in and out of sync, so sometimes they both rise up at the same time. I like to make things that are participatory. I like things that people can get involved with, because I have this idea that I think people kind of really think with their bodies in ways that they don't remember, that they think they did once, but they've forgotten that they used to think that way. And so all my pieces are things you can play with, but I'm also trying to address some larger philosophical kinds of issues and some conundrums and I kind of have this perhaps absurd notion that these things can be resolved somehow with play. So I try to make the works, accessible and friendly and fun and interactive, and they frequently require several people to work them. One thing it does is it gives people a chance to experience things, through their bodies rather than entirely through their minds. At the same time, their minds are being actively engaged in what's going on. So that it's there's kind of this strange connection that gets this sort of right brain, left brain connection that I'm hoping will happen, that people can actually bring these two things together at once, in the playing with my work, and that they can have this fun experience that's also got some kind of profound overtones and other kinds of resonances for them. I think of all these pieces kind of like an essay. Each one is kind of like an essay about some subject matter, so I'll start reading about the subject, and I'll read several books about it, and I'll get kind of immersed in the science and the art and the philosophy and these other aspects of some subject matter, and then I'll stop at a certain point, and it's sort of determined by how far away I am from the deadline. I'll stop the reading, and I'll get to work, and I won't really have much of an idea at all of what I'm going to be making, but I figure I've got to start with something. See, I'm hoping that these ideas that I've been reading about are kind of like so, deeply embedded in my brain at this point that they can't help but show up in the work. And so then I start working on things, and I'm looking at what I'm making, and I start to shape it, change it, as I'm going along, and it starts to look more and more like something like an idea. And then, if I'm lucky, I'll get some real good closure. Something will happen where I actually really get to see, where I want to go. And then I have to go back and redo the whole piece from the beginning to make it go in this direction. It's not usually the direction I thought I was heading in. It's usually another direction that's kind of related, but there's some kind of extra discovery that'll happen. That was more on the spur of the moment, that happened as a result of the working process. Sometimes it'll happen when I'm installing. Like the origins of life question is a big question that I tried to tackle in this one piece I did. It was called The Second Story, A Twice Failed Tale. Basically, that piece was trying to attempt to deal with somehow with the question, well, if everything has a cause, how do you have a beginning? Where do you find the origins of life if everything has a cause? And the answer was actually forced on me, and this is typical of the way it worked, was forced on me by the gallery refusing to remove a wall in the middle of the gallery. So I wound up having to separate all the causes from all the effects. I mean, I didn't have to, I had to separate something about the piece, so I chose to separate the causes and the effects. And what that made necessary, and something I've used a lot since then, is you had to cooperate. People who came to visit the show had to cooperate to get an experience of what was going on. And this, in fact, as it turns out, is one of the more contemporary theories of the origins of life. I wasn't aware of it. I discovered it through my artwork. So that's an example of how, the work helps to come up with these solutions to philosophical questions. So that's, that was a kind of an accident that occurred that really just completely transformed that piece and almost everything I've done since then. I've always tried to get more people involved, more people working on the thing. And I mean, in a piece like Sufficient Latitude here, everyone is in contact. In other pieces I have, so you can't see what the other person is doing, and you have to kind of form another kind of network of communication. And of course, that does occur, and this is one of the things about life that's so wonderful that, that I'm hoping to capture just a little bit of it in the art, maybe reify it a little bit. So that whole aspect of my work was an accident. Breakage has always been an important thing for me, which is why wood works so well with the pieces, because the wood is always not cooperating. It doesn't want to be a machine. But I'm making these machines. I'm making them out of the worst possible wood to make a machine out of, and machines shouldn't be made out of wood anyway. So I'm right away building in, the possibility of breakage. I mean, I know I'm going to do that. I know that things are going to start to malfunction and break, and hopefully they'll be doing that in interesting ways. So I get that kind of virtue built in by the failings of the materials, and then I also have the wood. Machines that are made out of wood have to be kind of bigger and less likely than a metal machine. So the pieces wind up having this ability to comment on this whole aspect of machinery, because they become these abstractions of machines, because they're made in the wrong material. And yet, you know, in spite of all of those things, they work. And so you've got this wonderful kind of quirky quality, I think, you know, that they're almost like cartoons of themselves, you know, so that they are themselves and they're abstractions of themselves at the same time, because they cross the line and they work. So, you know, the wood has been wonderful for that, although the reason I work in wood was because to pay my bills, I've been doing a lot of carpentry over the years, and my original sculptures were made out of concrete and plastic and, you know, and other materials like that. And as I moved from foundations to finished carpentry, I started making more, you know, things out of wood. The tools were the same, you know, the shop was the same, and, you know, and I do like wood, but I don't have this kind of amazing connection to it as a material. I like it and I respect it, but it's not the same kind of thing. I think I'm still a carpenter, you know, even when I'm doing these things. Although when I'm doing carpentry, you don't want things to break. In someone's house, you want to stay up. You know, when you're building these pieces, I want things to break. Certainly, the breaks always wind up with a look that I call it Band-Aid joinery. You know, it's an opportunity to make a point out of this sort of, you know, this frailness of this particular spot. So if the pieces haven't been around enough and they haven't broken enough, they don't have the look that I'm really going for yet. You know, I basically try to create a problem. This is fundamentally how I work, is I create a problem for myself. I pick some impossible task, the origins of life. You know, I will solve this with wood and latex, you know. And of course I know I'm not going to solve the problems, and yet I somehow manage to learn something in the process of doing things. You know, I mean, the key, of course, is always editing, you know, and somehow being honest with yourself. And you know, the question is, well, is that good enough, or do I have to do more with the piece? I love watching people play with the pieces. That's the biggest kick, you know. I feel like it's just so much fun to watch people play with them, you know, and to play with other people with them. Because as I say, I don't get to do that when I make them. When I make them modules, and I bring them here and I put them together, and I've got a heavy deadline. I have 7 days, 10 days, whatever it is, and I get the show all together and get the pieces working for the first time sometimes. And then, you know, and then I kind of collapse during the opening and watch people play with them, and so that's the first time anyone's played with them, is somebody else, not me. You know, so I love it. It's my vicarious thrill. So yeah, I hope that people get to play, and that they, you know, and they'll come away with something. Sometimes they'll come up with things that I hadn't really gotten, I hadn't really understood, and usually with a new piece, that'll happen. There'll be aspects of it that I hadn't figured out that they'll discover for me. And if I'm there, I get to witness this. And that's one of the great fun things, you know, is to see these new revelations, not only for them about things that I already knew they might get from it, but also things that I didn't know about. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping for, I think, you know, and you know, and I like people to be smiling when they leave. These are 3 pieces that are kind of like one piece, really. They're, you know, they're all about this interesting little phenomenon that Poincaré discovered at the end of the 19th century. He discovered that Newton's laws of gravity don't work very well for more than 2 bodies. If you have 2 bodies, you get an exact solution. If you have 3 bodies, you know, you wind up with having to add a fudge term at the end of the equation. With 4 bodies, you need 2 fudge terms, 5 bodies, 3 fudge terms. So the equations wind up with all these little fudge terms, and these fudge terms are a source of error, and those little errors can be magnified under certain circumstances. So Poincaré was incredibly prescient at the time. He was present and prescient, but he was able to realize that this was a route to chaos theory, although it wasn't called chaos theory at the time. So I'm thinking about all those things. Of course, I'm really also thinking about bodies, not as celestial bodies, as planets, but more like human bodies. And so I have these sweet little pieces, and the first one is kind of a sweet little thing. It's a two-body problem. And when you work it like that, you set this one body sets the other in motion, and it kind of vibrates, but it's all very simple and and sweet, in a way. It's a perfect solution, if you will. With three bodies, on the other hand, it gets a little more complicated. Same kind of motion to operate it. And you can see these bodies in this window here. There's two bodies in there, and sometimes a third body will appear in this window. It may be hard to see, and it doesn't happen all that often. So you've already got this sense of things not always working out. And when you open this up, I love the little inner sanctum noise there. You can see this has gotten a lot more complicated and has all these little fudge factors. There's a little adjusting screw up here, to get these things exactly in the right alignment so that when you hit them, they're going to work out. And so, with three bodies, you've got all this complexity that's added in now. And then, of course, all of this stuff, all of our sense of any kind of scientific accomplishments at all is based on this incredible amount of faith. And faith is really sort of like voodoo. So I've got this final piece, which is my voodoo with flowchart. And for this piece, you've got these voodoo pins here. And the pins are, were left on string that would purposely get tangled, which of course string always gets tangled. So you've got the tangled string, which is a little bit like the chaos theory. And if you poke these voodoo pins in, to this piece here, and especially if you do it while you're pulling on the tape, you get this little record that you can see of your interaction here. And what you're doing, if we open this up, you can see, also got a nice little chaotic pile of paper down here, which is, the record of everyone having played with these things. What you're doing when you're poking with the voodoo pins is you're poking at your vessel of suspended disbelief. So I've got this little boat here with the pencil on the end, and you're poking at the vessel of suspended disbelief, and of course leaving a mark on the chart there. So this is a voodoo with flowchart, and it's sort of about that act of faith that we have to and interestingly enough, this one won't stay open. The other two stay open when you open them. This one keeps shutting itself. So there's a little mystery involved in voodoo and faith. So that's this little scientific entrance into the interpersonal possibilities of faith and chaos theory. So this is a piece called the configuration space of an arthritic 3 crank. And this is also a mathematical piece, just like the three that are on the other side of the wall. And they're kind of like two sides of the coin. This was inspired by an article I read about mathematical manifolds, where they apparently have this thought experiment where they make up these little crank objects that'll sweep out a certain kind of space, and the length of the cranks and the kind of joints they have will all become components in an equation. I don't think they actually build these things. I think they just imagine them, and that's sort of what I was doing. But instead of trying to imagine the space that this was sweeping out, I was much more interested in this kind of gangly image I was getting, this kind of gangly joint-like kind of quality of the piece. So of their image, of this 3 crank image. So I started making them, and of course the joints I made, in the mathematical models are completely universal joints because they can move freely in any direction. My joints are not completely universal. They have these spots where they kind of jam. And so I was thinking, aha, they're not universal, they're arthritic. So I'm thinking, okay, and then so then of course by making them arthritic, I wind up with this sense that this has kind of got more of a human association. So, if I don't, you can move that and you can watch this thing go. And it's sort of, and it's kind of like, I actually, this reminds me, when I made this piece, I remembered The first time I slept with my, then-to-be wife, we had a single bed, and there was always one limb that didn't fit, There was something that was leaning off that had to be up on the wall or down on the floor. There was some elbow or some knee or something that had to be somewhere else. And so, I don't know, I guess this is vaguely related to that, but it has that nice kind of gangly elbow quality anyway. So, mathematics without the math. Originally, this piece was started out as a set of these large wooden parabolas, about 4-foot diameter parabolas made out of wood. And the idea was to make an all-wood parabolic microphone that I could communicate across this hillside with. And you would speak through these wood tubes, and the sound would come out at the focus of the parabola, and it would be projected out to the other parabola. And of course, as this friend of mine pointed out kind of wryly, well, they have a gain of about 1, he said, which sort of means that they are just about as good as not being there at all. So I realized that they weren't working. So I suddenly changed the name of the piece to Why Words Fail. I could talk about the fallibility of communication, and that might at least salvage the piece. But then as soon as I said Why Words Fail, I decided to amplify this whole idea a little bit. And give people an opportunity to add, their own failures to mine. So I put these empty blank wood tags out. This is all outdoors now, and some pencils, and allowed people to write things on the tags. And people would write various things on it, explanations of why words fail. Fear. The next time I did this piece, I was in Florida for this big retrospective, and on the stucco wall outside the front of the museum, it said Museum of Contemporary Art, and in these kind of raised metal letters, that were, so you get a little shadow behind them on the stucco wall. And right below that, it used to say Palm Beach Community College, but Palm Beach Community College had pulled their support out. Those words had failed, if you will, and it left these holes in the wall. So at the last second, and during the setup for the show in Florida, I decided I was going to put Why Words Fail out there, right underneath the Museum of Contemporary Art, and be right in those same holes that the Palm Beach Community College had left vacant. So I made these wood letters up for Why Words Fail, and I did a setup something like this, and I got all sorts of things, all sorts of responses there. Some of the responses there were like, because this was out on the street now, not in an art gallery where you get this kind of higher level commentary. Out on the street, you would get answers like, die yuppie scum. So this piece has kind of taken on this whole other life. I've been able to use this whole question of why words fail, this whole problem with communications, and allow people to get in and answer it their own ways. And I think my favorite answer, there's a lot of answers here that are all very interesting and many that are quite profound, but this is my favorite here is actually, why not fail? That's as good an explanation for me of how my art comes about, in a sense, through these kind of failures and these accidents and how things kind of build on each other. I feel like less than alive when I'm not making art. I don't, if I'm just doing carpentry, if I've been doing it for too long, I don't really feel like I'm alive. I don't, there is a piece in the show here called Prurient Interest, and it's actually an homage to Jean Tinguely. He was once asked if he said, the interviewer was saying, your work is so much fun. You must have a great time making this work. It must be just so much fun to do this. And he said, well, making art is really not so much about fun. It's more about like having an itch, and you scratch it and you feel better for a while. And it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'm wired this way. There's some kind of obsession, And it's partly this obsession to wanting to know how things work, what makes things happen. And for some reason, I feel like I'm actually able to answer these philosophical questions by making the artwork. So I feel like I'm not only getting the chance to play with machines and toys and things and tinker, these large-scale tinker toys that I create, but I also get to kind of figure out, how things are working. And I think I always sort of wanted to be an academic while I really didn't want to be an academic. So I get to sort of sit a little bit in both camps with this, and it satisfies a lot of needs, on that level. I think it's just. But it's probably mainly driven by this obsession and, to make something, and which is probably driven by this sense that I'm mortal, which, it's sort of like a form of procreation. This country in general doesn't place very much of a premium on intellectual life. And cities like this have become almost emblematic of that because, space becomes this huge .com premium. And I don't know, this country is so concerned about money and making money that in general that, it's never really paid much attention to the life of the mind. And I think it's, I don't really expect that to change, unfortunately. I would love it if this country had more of a sense of that, because I think that's sort of the fundamental thing. If people in this country really appreciated, the intellectual process and that aspect of the quality of life, I think art would be held in a higher accord, and then artists would have more grants, more money, something they would be able to live a little bit better. I mean, I don't think artists are ever into the art to get rich, and they would never be rich. They aren't rich in any country that I know of. But in other countries, artists are. It's actually everybody thinks of the arts as something that's important, whether they like this particular artist and what they're doing or not. They do think that the arts are important to their life and to their sense of themselves. There's Carlos Williams has a poem, and I'm not going to remember it well enough, but to do it direct justice. But basically, what he's saying at this one point is, well, why write poetry? Why bother with this? And he's saying, well, and he doesn't really explain it, but what he says is that there's something almost intangible there, that people are dying every day for the lack of this in their lives. There's something about the sense of ourselves as having some greater meaning, some greater purpose, something more. Maybe religion provided this at one time or another in our culture, and this is a religious country. There are a lot of people who are probably turning to religion for those very reasons. But for me, it had to be art that would provide that sense that there was more to life than working, than trying to have more money. And there are these riddles and these problems, that just are. I mean, on the one hand, they're easily dismissed as being, oh, that's just this logical problem, let the logicians deal with that, but it's irrelevant. On the other hand, it's something about the way we think and the way we work. It's something about understanding ourselves. It's so, I think, I don't know, just seems so important to me.